Good morning, everyone. Throne speech was yesterday. They elected a Speaker of the House, and the Speaker was Anthony Rota, and he was elected. And then they went into, the pomp and circumstance of doing the Speaker or the Throne speech. And the person who read the Throne speech is former astronaut Miss Payette. I think that's how you say her name. And it's a 28-minute long speech, and it starts around, an hour and a half, hour and 30 minutes. Right about there. That's when it starts. And I'm going to give you the overview, the notes that I made. And my notes are in the description if you want to have a read. But the Throne speech sets the course for the next term of governance, right? And so they say, these are the things we're going to focus on. And I found what they focused on to be interesting. They mentioned the United Nations. They mentioned going after the United Nations seat. They mentioned putting in the United Nations the rights of Indigenous persons or rights of Indigenous people, and that will be implemented ASAP. So there's a lot of call-outs to the United Nations. They talk about gun bans. They said they'll ban assault rifles. They'll give the cities the power to ban handguns. So all of those things are happening within this Throne speech. They talk about tax cuts for all but the most wealthy. They talk about planting 2 billion trees as an offset. And I wanted to read this part to you because I think that it's interesting. There's certain parts of the CBC article. So here's the CBC article. Link is in the description. Certain parts that were interesting to me as well. So during the speech, I thought, why are they using this spaceship verbiage? Like, I've heard it before. I've heard other organizations and other people use like the spaceship Earth idea. It's mostly a UN idea. So I thought, man, they're painting this whole thing with the UN. But then I found out that she's an astronaut. So I think that paints that whole idea in a different light, because once you've actually been outside the planet on another, spaceship looking down at the planet, you're like, wow, man, this is wild. Because I think that gives you a different perspective, one that I couldn't possibly have. And if somebody offered me a free ticket on a spaceship, said, do you want to go to Mars just for 6 months? I would say, no, I'm staying right here. Not a chance. You couldn't get me on a spaceship. Oh my goodness. I've watched Star Trek. I know what it's all about. Okay, back to the CBC article. Payette, a former astronaut, said Canadians must work together in collaboration because, quote, we are inextricably bound to the same space-time continuum and on board the same planetary spaceship. So I thought that was weird. The Throne speech was grouped under 4 themes: fighting climate change, strengthening the middle class, Indigenous reconciliation, keeping Canadians safe and healthy, and positioning Canada for success in an uncertain world. Right, so it's the whole speech closely tacked to all of those themes. They talked about the murdered and missing women and girls inquiry, and they talked about justice within that inquiry. Like we did that report, and we're going to pursue justice. The opiate crisis, they linked that to pharmacare. They said if only we could prescribe those meds. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. They talked about military spending and mental health care support and veteran homelessness. But again, at the end of this, Jagmeet Singh says there's a lot of pretty words, but not a whole lot of action, right? Their whole plan for climate change. Hold on, I'm going to scroll down here because this is the important part here. Okay, so that's a tax cut coming, but the climate change. Okay, so I'll read this whole thing, but this is the climate change aspect. The Throne speech reiterated much of what the Liberal Party promised in the last election campaign. The first order of business for the 43rd Parliament will be enacting a new middle-class tax cut and making the Canada Child Benefit, payments to parents to help offset the cost of raising a child, more generous. Payette said voters returned a minority parliament dominated by progressive parties determined to take ambitious climate action now. The government promised to defend its national price on carbon to help curb greenhouse gas emissions while pushing ahead with a plan to render the country, quote, net zero on emissions by 2050. The plan would mean making deep cuts to carbon emissions or offsetting those emissions through other actions that scrub carbon from the atmosphere, such as planting trees. The Liberals have promised to plant 2 billion trees. So CBC is saying you could cut emissions or you could do something that would offset those emissions. And that's what the Liberals are going to do. They're going to plant trees. And this is an offset, right? Do offsets work? Okay, here it is. Quote from the CBC, from the Global News article. It says, Quote, but in forking over that money, what has actually been achieved? If you're looking to help address the ever-worsening effects of climate change, should you purchase carbon offsets? The short answer is yes. Go ahead, says Kate Irvine, a professor of international development studies at St. Mary's University and author of Carbon, but only if you've done your homework and an offset isn't the sum total of your strategy to fight climate change. This isn't about fixing the problem. It's simply saying, I've done something bad here. How can I try to make things better? Envy says. Right. And getting on a plane is not a bad thing. You shouldn't be shaming people for something like that, or driving or whatever. Anyway, regardless of that, I think that it's funny that essentially the whole plan of the Canadian government is funding a massive offset program, and that's it. And also carbon taxes that you get back that don't reduce emissions. If you're not sure about what I'm talking about, have a look at British Columbia. British Columbia has had a carbon tax since 2008 and has not reduced emissions at all. So what's the response, right? They've talked in the throne speech, they talked about reaching across the aisle and tackling money laundering and talking about using ideas for other parties. They talk about universal dental care. And they say that you can raise the bar on what politics is like in this country. That's a 1 hour and 58 minutes. The tail end of that, you can raise the bar. Really? I mean, the Liberal government has been one of the most divisive, dirty politics government I've ever seen. And they're saying, you can raise the bar. I mean, anything would be raising the bar on Justin Trudeau. Anything. A monkey in a suit would be raising the bar. You know, like the top hat monkey. Unbelievable. Here is Mr. Scheer's response to the throne speech, and he's not happy. Here we go.
One brief mention of the resource sector in the entire speech, no mention of Alberta or Saskatchewan. What is this government's message to Canadians in those provinces?
It's an extremely negative message. Justin Trudeau has caused the damage that is affecting our natural resource sector, our oil and gas sector. Billions of dollars of investment have left Canada, have left the energy sector to be invested in other countries. This notion, this idea that Mr. Trudeau likes to put about that there's some that the people of Alberta and Saskatchewan are victims of a global phenomenon is just false. Billions of dollars have left. They're being invested in other countries. Businesses are going out of business. They're going bankrupt, and they're selling at auction their equipment to American companies to build pipelines and invest in the energy sector in the United States. So today's throne.
So Scheer's literally saying Canadian companies are selling at auction to American companies that are putting exactly the same energy extracting and refining and whatever uses to use in extracting the same energy down south, only Canada is not benefiting from it at all. And these companies would be here if it wasn't for these bad policies. I agree with a lot of the things he's saying. It's just unfortunate that he didn't talk about any of that at all. I mean, really, here's Jagmeet Singh. He didn't talk about any of that prior to the election. He not very strong, blah, blah, blah. My issues with Scheer are long documented. Here's Mr. Singh talking about, I'm just going to give you the first minute, or maybe less. He's very clear about it. But at the same time, his problem, I feel like, okay, on climate change, let's say, there's a concrete thing that the government is trying to do, plant trees for climate change. But fundamentally, they don't own enough land. The federal government isn't in charge of trees, right? So Singh could attack that, but instead he says what he says. It's funny to me because I don't think any throne speech other than the NDP's right, here's Prime Minister Singh, would be acceptable to him. So I don't know, but here we go.
See, after hearing the throne speech, if the Liberal government thinks that this is good enough to deal with the struggles that people are facing right now, then they are wrong. This is not good enough. What we're seeing is a lot of, again, pretty words, but not any concrete actions. We just got through a campaign where people told us that they can't afford the medication. Millions of Canadians are making difficult choices to cut their pills in half or to skip taking the medication they need to stay healthy. We know that so many Canadians cannot find a place to call.
So Singh's focusing on pharmacare, homelessness, right? And sure, maybe he's got a point. Maxime Bernier says, the Liberal plan for a brighter tomorrow, more intrusion into provincial jurisdiction, more useless subsidies to fight climate change, more unjustified attacks against gun owners, more alignment with UN and campaigning for UN seat, more spending and deficits. Yeah, yep, that's pretty much it. That's pretty much it. And, well, on not throne speech news, here's CBC reporting this morning that Canada's unemployment rate climbs to 5.9%. The Canadian economy posted its biggest monthly job loss since the financial crisis. The financial I find it interesting that they don't put a date on it. They could be mentioning any financial crisis. I'm assuming they mean the 2008 financial crisis, but they don't put a date on the financial crisis they're talking about, so who knows? Back to the article. As the unemployment rate also pushed higher in November, StatsCan reported Friday. The economy lost 71,200 jobs last month, and the unemployment rate rose to 5.9%. Compared with 5.5% in October, the data agency said. Economists on average had expected a gain of 10,000 jobs and the unemployment rate to hold steady at 5.5%, according to financial markets data from Refinitiv. The number of full-time jobs fell by 38,400, while part-time employment fell by 32,800. The goods-producing sector lost 26,000 jobs in the month, as the number of manufacturing jobs fell by 27,500, and the natural resources sector shed 6,500. Meanwhile, the services sector lost 44,400 jobs as the number in public administration fell by 24,900 in November. So, it's interesting. This is interesting too. Compared with November last year, the economy has added 293,000 jobs. So I'm not sure how that all works out. Is it just a blip? Back to the article, the jobs report followed a decision by the Bank of Canada earlier this week to keep its key interest rate on hold at 1.75%, where it's been set for more than a year. In making its decision, the central bank said the Canadian economy has remained resilient despite the global uncertainty caused by a trade war between the United States and China. The Bank of Canada has stood out from many of its international peers that have moved to cut rates and loosen monetary policy in response to weakening in the global economy. The U.S. Federal Reserve has cut its rate 3 times this year. So, interesting, right? I've also seen reports about the price of food, and I haven't gone through this. It's been on my list every day, but other things have been more important. So the price of food is going up by about $500 next year, cumulatively across the year. So, that's still a pretty big increase, especially when everything else is also going up and people are being evicted so landlords can rent their apartments out at a higher rate, right? This is happening in Canada. Not to mention taxes going up, not to mention city taxes going up. Toronto is looking at a levy going up 10%, right? It's incredible how much everything is going up, right? And nobody talks about the carbon tax, Bear Patrol tax. Nobody talks about how that impacts everything, right? Really interesting. It's really interesting. They also talk about climate change in the throne speech, and they were talking. Hold on, I'm going to highlight it here. At 1 hour and 41 minutes, she talks about climate change, and she talks about the fact that she says climate change science has been correct for decades. And I saw this the other day. Here's sciencemag.org, published on December 12th, I believe. December 12th, December 4th. And they say even 50-year-old climate models correctly predicted global warming. And no, they didn't. Here's the 1978 science facts talking about the coming ice age. This whole documentary flies in the face of these people who are saying, and within our government saying, decades of scientists agree that this is a really big problem. No. That is incorrect. The models have consistently been wrong. The models are garbage. They have not been accurate. They have predicted calamity at in 20 years, it's going to be terrible. It's going to be an ice age. It's going to be global warming and blah, 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 blah. Latitude is a thing, right? In June, in the Yukon, it's 3 degrees. In June, in Toronto, it is 30 degrees. In June, in Mumbai, India, it is much hotter than Toronto. People live in all of those latitudes, right? Think about things, people. My goodness. So it's just very frustrating to have a government that says provably false things, because then they're reported as fact, right? Planting 2 billion trees is going to fix climate change in the whole world. And then, yay, we can maybe repeal the tax, but not the GST or the PST or the municipal tax or all the other taxes. Can't wait for that death tax. Yay. Right? They're double dipping and triple dipping. And you know what they use for public consent? The surveys like this. I was going to go through this survey, but the video is already long enough. And the answers are predetermined to give them, no matter what you choose, it's going to be a positive answer for the Liberals. Oh, well, more people like the real action to address climate change, but a majority of people liked more money for the middle class, right? Like there is no get your hand out of gun control, right? There is no stop being completely boneheaded on the international stage. You can't tell them what you really think. All you have are these 4 choices, right? Unbelievable. So these surveys, and they use this to manufacture further consent, because they put out news articles on their fully paid for CBC News and other platforms that say exactly what they want, right? And they say, hey, whatever, write an article around this number, because thousands of people are on board with this and don't care that the survey is driving you to give a specific or at least liberal positive answer. There is no way to give a negative answer. Frustrating, especially when, again, the government's they throw out the years of data, because we have that data. Pearson Airport has that data. I've used that data. We can prove that the history is incorrect. We can prove that the predictions were wrong, but they don't care. They threw the data out, and now they're pushing the lie. Unbelievable. Pretty soon it'll be hate speech to point that out. Thanks for watching, everybody. Check out CanadaPoly.com and have a wonderful, wonderful